Hey folks, this is Rhykker with a Diablo 3 patch 2.6.1 Barbarian build guide. Currently on the test server, the Whirlwind Barbarian has received a massive buff and is cleared as high as a Greater Rift 111 solo. Admittedly, that's with a lot of Paragon levels and quite perfected gear, but moving into Season 12, every one of us will be able to clear a lot higher with Whirlwind Barbarians. In this footage, you're seeing me clear a Greater Rift 80, but it's with very unoptimized gear. That said, the gearing for this build could be a little finicky, and I'd say that this build is a bit more dependent on getting optimized gear than other builds. That said, you can breeze through a 70, and if you apply yourself, definitely go much higher, 80s, 90s, but it will take a little bit more work than some of the other builds that we've covered. So in this video, we'll go over the skills and the gear that you want to rock a Whirlwind Barbarian in Season 12. And it all starts with the Wrath of the Waste set. We're ignoring the 2-piece bonus, we're not using Rend, we're going pure spin to win Barbarian. If this build changes throughout PTR, I'll have an updated version in the future. There is a possibility that Rend may end up being worked into this build, but for now it's not. Now the 4-piece bonus, a nice change here. Not only do you take half damage while whirlwinding, but that damage reduction now extends to 3 seconds after you stop whirlwinding, so you won't die the instant you let go of whirlwind. This gives you time to hit some of your other skills. And then lastly, the 6-piece bonus just buffs the hell out of your whirlwind damage. Also mandatory for this build, be it in your cube or equipped on yourself, will be a Skull Grasp. This is a very rare ring that got a nice damage buff in patch 2.6.1. Odds are you'll have it in the cube, but of the rings we cover, you basically just want to cube the one that is the worst rolled. Mantle of Channeling is very important for this build. You deal more damage and you take less damage while whirlwinding. Put that in your cube. For your weapons, you'll either want the Bolcathos set or the Istvan set. Now, Bolcathos is a lot more common. This set makes you deal more damage while whirlwinding and move faster and generate more resource. The big reason to opt for this, apart from it just being easier to gear for, is the Fury generation. The Istvan set, Little Rogue and Slanderer, will give you a nice buff to your damage, your attack speed, and your armor. This will result overall in more damage, but again, these are two super rare items. It's a lot more difficult to get ideal stats on them than on the Bolcathos weapons, and they'll leave you a bit more fury thirsty. For a weapon in the cube, we're going with the Furnace, simply because we don't really have a much better option here. That's more damage against elites, and this build excels at killing trash, suffers against single targets, so that additional damage against the elites is helpful. At lower difficulty, if you feel you don't need that extra damage, you can always go with an Ingum. The Ingum gives you a good amount of cooldown reduction once you kill an elite pack, and in speedruns you're generally hunting from elite pack to elite pack. For your belt, you'll want a Pride of Cassius. We want to have the toughness buff of Ignore Pain up 100% of the time, so we are building around this. We're getting just enough cooldown reduction for that, and for any serious Greater Rift pushing, you absolutely need to have a Pride of Cassius. If you're doing easier content, then you can instead go with a Chilanix Chain. This instead gives you a nice move speed buff whenever you use Warcry. For your bracers, Nemesis bracers will help you spawn more elites. This is generally preferred for speedruns, but we also see it used in Greater Rift pushing. But if you feel you instead need extra damage, you can go with Strong Arm Bracers. And if you instead really want toughness, you can go for Ancient Parthan Defenders. But this will be a little more difficult to gear for because in order to get stunned enemies, you're going to have to roll onto your gear as secondary effects, chance to crowd control enemies. For your two other rings, you'll want a Convention of Elements for more damage, and an Obsidian Ring of the Zodiac. This will help us even more with our cooldowns. Lastly, for the amulet, you'll go with a Hellfire amulet to maximize your damage. You could always go with a survivability amulet like Eye of Etlich, or one that grants you immunity to elements. For our legendary gems, we're getting a Taeguk. We'll be able to keep up the max stacks at all times. This gives us more damage and more toughness. We're going with a Pain Enhancer in order to turbo buff our attack speed once there's a lot of enemies around us. And without getting too deep into a discussion about breakpoints, this results in more damage. Then lastly, we're going with a Bane of the Stricken. This is a build that is really strong against large groups of enemies, but suffers quite a bit against the Rift Guardian. When dealing with single targets, the Whirlwind Barbarian really tends to suffer, so a Bane of the Stricken becomes even more important than with other builds. More so, the extra attack speed that you're going to get from your Pain Enhancer will tie into your Bane of the Stricken. Now, before we dive into the specifics of what you want on every piece of gear, let's take a look at the skills. First, we want Battle Rage, Bloodshed. How this skill works has changed somewhat in patch 2.6.1, but it still deals tons of damage. Because of this, we want to get our crit chance as high as possible, because this skill now takes your recent hits and spreads that damage around to all targets. Our main damage source, of course, is going to be Whirlwind. We're going with the Blood Funnel rune in order to have some sustain, and again, this is why critical hit chance is very important, because it is crits that will return life. If you're going with the Isvan set, you might have to go with Wind Shear instead for resource management. And if you're speedrunning, you can go with Hurricane in order to vortex in enemies. We're going with Wrath of the Berserker Insanity. This gives us more everything. It's just an amazing buff, and we want to aim for 100% uptime. We're going with Ignore Pain, Ignorance is Bliss. You can go with Ironhide instead if you're having trouble keeping up that buff, but ideally you won't have any issues doing that. Ignorance is Bliss instead allows you to heal while it's up. More sustain. If you're instead going for speedruns, you can swap that out for Speed Marathon if you don't need the toughness. We're going with Warcry, Veteran's Warning. Both Impunity and Veteran's Warning both give you a toughness buff, but Veteran's Warning will generally be more beneficial for you personally. If you do tend to see Impunity, it's generally if Impunity will better help other people in your party. And then lastly, we're going with Ancient Spear, Rage Flip. There's a couple reasons that we're using this, and you could go with a different option. Because Ancient Spear is a spender, it helps us with our Obsidian Ring of the Zodiac triggering. Let's say your Ignore Pain is still on cooldown and you don't have the buff. Rather than engage into a group of enemies, you can shoot out an Ancient Spear, and hopefully that gives you the extra second that you need to pop the skill again. But it's also used as a precision repositioning tool. Let's say there are enemies sitting in a bunch of Molten, well, try to drag them over out of that. If you're trying to group 2 packs of monsters together in order to build up more density to deal more damage, Ancient Spear can help you reposition. Another option here is Ground Stomp, Wrenching Smash. This is a overall better repositioning tool, or repositioning of enemies tool. It's not as long range, but it can grab multiple enemies. It's a lot more forgiving in its aim. However, it is a generator rather than a spender, so it will not trigger your Aurots. And then your last option here for speedruns would be Furious Charge, Merciless Assault. For speedruns, you'd want to swap out your rings for a Focus and Restraint set, and Furious Charge can serve as a pretty reliable generator in order to trigger half that set's damage buff. It's also just a great repositioning tool. Whirlwind already gives you tremendous mobility, but sometimes tremendous isn't enough. For our passives, Nerves of Steel gives us an extra life. Boon of Bolcathos highly reduces the cooldown on our Wrath of the Berserker, must have. Ruthless really helps us finish off enemies. This is particularly important because this build is great at dealing a lot of damage when there's a lot of enemies on screen, but as they're dying off, you might be left with a few stragglers with a little bit of health, so perfect at finishing them off. Rampage gives us an excellent damage buff, and because we have 5 passives in total with the Hellfire, ideally you want to put Nerves of Steel on the Hellfire. It doesn't ultimately matter, but just if you ever want to change build, Nerves of Steel is kind of a staple. But for your last passive, you can go with Weapons Master or Berserker Rage. Onto the exact stats you want on every piece of gear. You're aiming for a total of about 40% cooldown reduction. You'll get this with your Paragon points with a diamond in the helm, cooldown on your shoulders, cooldown on one of your rings, and 1 weapon. So ideally you want on your shoulders, strength, vitality, cooldown reduction, area damage. For your helm, strength, crit chance, and then either vitality or whirlwind damage, depending on how ballsy you are. For your amulet, physical damage, assuming you're going with the physical rune on whirlwind, otherwise go with whatever elemental damage your whirlwind is. Crit chance, crit damage. For your gloves, you want strength, crit chance, crit damage, area damage. Area damage is very important to this build. If you feel like you're not dealing enough damage, area damage could be the culprit. As I said, the gearing for this build is a little fussy. For your chest, you want all toughness stats. For your bracers, element, strength, vitality, crit. For your belt, all toughness stats. For your pants, all toughness stats. For your boots, you want strength, vitality, all resist, and whirlwind damage. Very important to get that whirlwind damage on the boots. For your Obsidian Ring of the Zodiac, attack speed, crit chance, cooldown. And for your other ring, crit chance, crit damage, area damage. Between your 2 weapons, you want strength on both of them, you want cooldown on one of them, you want area damage on at least one of them, and then attack speed is a good choice. For Paragon points, total move speed up to 25, then everything into strength. For offense, crit chance, cooldown, crit damage. For defense, all resist, life, armor. For utility, area damage, resource cost reduction, life per hit. And that wraps up this video. In the video description, I'll have a link to the most up-to-date version of the highest clear of this build, so that if there's any changes to the gearing or the skills, you can just verify down below. Leave a comment with your thoughts. Are you happy with the buffed Barbarian? Thanks for watching. Special thanks to my Twitch and Patreon supporters for making these videos possible. If you enjoyed this video, please share it. Check out these other videos and subscribe to join Rhykker's Raiders for more Diablo content.